just about everybody I know in my age group can tell you a story or two of a little bit of misspent youth. Part of mine, in good old Noble Park, Victoria, involved a practice that is not exclusive to just that neighbourhood, even though we had a unique way of doing it. In the 80s and the 90s, the first couple of years of being a licensed driver with your own car involved doing this practice called blockies. You might call them zoomies or other different things. You get into the car with your mates, you do a Macca's drive-through, or you go get a kebab somewhere, depending on where you lived, and then you just drive around for hours. You'd have the stereo blaring. You'd wear out first and second gear because that's pretty much all you pretty much use. It's more about volume than actual power. And in all your evening travels, you kind of never leave the suburb. And if you're honest, you never leave the main street. Up and down, up and down. My stepdad tells me about his days doing blockies. You know, if he'd been alive now, 44, he'd be he'd be 81 now. And he'd do blockies around cows in Phillip Island. And an old FX Holden. And he got pulled over for screaming up the top thing and too loud in first gear, apparently. Noble Park was set on the Princes Highway. It's actually the same national highway that the Jubilee Highway sits on. We've been linked forever. And we would often just cruise up and down about a 3-kilometre stretch from one traffic light to the other. From Browns Road, where the RACV head office was, through to the Eleanor Road McDonald's, where the skate rink was. And we would do a U-ey and come back. Then do a U-ey and go back. That was pretty much the space. You'd hang out, you'd stop at this service station, you'd stop here and there, and you'd have these little hangouts. But that was your existence for an evening. Occasionally there'd be a friendly race at the lights. Car come up beside you, give you a bit of a rev, and you go, all right, no worries. And because I owned Valiants and a Cortina, I was pretty much unbeatable on that stretch. Misspent youth. Doing blockies is fine and even fun when you're 18 years old. But I think all of our wives, men, would agree with me here that it's probably a bit unbecoming if you're 50 and still doing it. We can talk with nostalgia about it. As here in the room, some of you and I have talked about that. And some people online too. I know who's online. I see some of you as well. We can kind of laugh at the kids in their Commodores on Commercial Street as they race past Presto in first gear. I'm going, oh man, you're just waiting for someone to get booked there. But our days of doing that stuff is long gone. On one front, we simply can't afford the gearboxes and the fines anymore. But on another, we know we've really outgrown that as we've matured, for the most part. We are moving deeper into the book of Joshua this morning. And I will invite you to open your Bibles to Joshua chapter 22 today. I'm skipping a few. Marguerite will pick up, we'll backtrack a bit next week. And Pete got a great area to cover as well. So the next 2 weeks are going to be really good. For my points this morning to come together and to be right and to give us a train of thought here, we actually need to understand a few historical parts of the wilderness narrative. The wilderness narrative starts with Numbers chapter 13. In chapter 13, well, actually it starts with Exodus, but the part I want to point to here is where we get to Numbers chapter 13. The nation had done roughly 2 years of wandering and is now approaching the border of Canaan. And we're told there that 12 spies are sent to check things out and spend 40 days doing so. Upon return, the faith-filled ones prove to be the minority. And then the nation is consigned to another 40 years of doing blockies in the southern peninsula, in the Sinai Peninsula. In Numbers 14, the Lord, in response to this, the Lord makes this decree. For 40 years, 1 year for each of the 40 days you explored the land, you will suffer for your sins and know what it is like to have me against you. Just think about that for a moment. You had 40 days of seeing hope. And for every day that God showed you hope, and every time you said no, God said, I'm giving you a year of waste. Don't let that be the legacy you leave or what is written on your tombstone. For every day of staring God in the face and going, that opportunity is not for me, is going to put you back in the wilderness and set you back a year. What an awful story to tell your next generation that these guys in the wilderness had to do. But then the rest of Numbers tells both a hopeful and hopeless story at the same time. Moses continues to teach the people about the way of Canaan, knowing that only the next generation will see it, while the adults in front of him will be buried in the desert sand. Joshua leads various military events in that region, and he leads the army well, further showing what Israel was missing out on with each victory. We could have been winning these victories over the river, but no, we have to do it here instead. In the wilderness, the people live in constant rebellion, grumbling, and dabbling with idolatry all that time. And the priesthood and even the Lord himself step in often to punish along the way. A terrible blight on their journey occurs in Numbers 25, where Moabite women seduce the nation and get amongst all the men in a region called Peor. We go, oh yeah, I can mess up and God will forgive me. Let me give you a reality check here. This story of Peor lasted 4,000 years in the Jewish narrative. It was mentioned in Revelation and became a type of false teaching in the church named by Peter. A terrible blight on the Jewish people in this space, and it remained in their whole Jewish story. The wilderness began as a time of initial freedom and wonderful rehearsal. It ended for many as a tale of wasted opportunity. By Numbers 26, it appears the people are getting closer to a move towards Canaan. A second census of the people is presented with a whole new batch of people numbered and ready to go. In the words of Scripture, it says this, not one of them was among those counted by Moses and Aaron the priest when they counted the Israelites in the desert of Sinai. In other words, these are the adults who left the captivity, left slavery. For the Lord had told these Israelites they would surely die in the wilderness. Not one of them was left except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. So for all intents and purposes, Israel seems good to go with Canaan possession. They're all done, bar the commissioning and the reminders of Deuteronomy. But the reluctance to cross Jordan emerges once again. Numbers 32. The Reubenites, the Gadites, who had very large herds and flocks, saw that the lands of Jazer and Gilead were suitable for livestock. So they came to Moses and Eleazar, the priest, and said to the leaders of the community and said, Adaroth, Dibon, Jazer, Nimrah, Heshbon, Elileh, Sebam, Nebo, and Beon, the land of the Lord subdued before the people of Israel, are suitable for livestock, and your servants have livestock. If we have found favor in your eyes, let this land be given to your servants as our possession. Do not make us cross the Jordan. Do not make us cross the Jordan. Moses and the people are rightly angered by this development. They had a poor track record of unbelief, and Moses is rightly worried about the way God might respond to this. But we also don't see Moses leading a prayer meeting or using any discernment here either. An arrangement is reached. The military commit to hopping over and helping the other tribes receive what is theirs. Their livestock get a paddock. They get some free cities due to recent battle victories. But the long-term considerations of this arrangement are not in play until we get to this part of Joshua. I needed that backstory to take us to where we are now. Follow along in your Bibles. I will skip a few verses as we go along, but you'll be able to follow what I'm doing here. Then Joshua summoned the Reubenites, the Gadites, the half-tribe of Manasseh, and said to them, "You have done all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded, and you have obeyed me in everything I commanded. For a long time now, to this very day, you have not deserted your fellow Israelites, but have carried out the mission the Lord your God gave you. Now that the Lord your God has given them rest as he promised, return to your homes in the land that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you on the other side of the Jordan. But be very careful to keep the commandment and the law that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you, to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, to keep his commands and hold fast to him and serve him with all your heart and with all your soul." There's a good summary of how to live a Christian life, isn't it? Then Joshua sent them home. He blessed them, saying, "Return to your homes with your great wealth, with large herds of white livestock, with silver, gold, bronze, and iron, and a great quantity of clothing, and divide the plunder from your enemies with your fellow Israelites." In verse 10 it says, "When they came to Geliloth, near the Jordan, in the land of Canaan, the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh built an imposing altar there by the Jordan." I'll summarize a few things here because the chapter takes a good 10 minutes to read. And it's worth doing in your own time, but I'm going to skip a few verses and give you some Barnes notes here. The rest of Israel send both an army and a delegation to investigate this matter. Fortunately, Joshua sends both. They're not coming in going all guns blazing. They've got Phinehas with them. They see an altar. They assume a rogue form of worship emerging. They rightly want answers. Phinehas, the priest, is the leader of the delegation, and he, in my mind, is one of the unsung heroes of the late wilderness and early Canaan period of Israel. They are rightly stung by past errors of Israel. Achan's sin is in recent memory, what Peter spoke about a while back with the Jericho conquest and holding back some of the stuff. The Moabite seduction I mentioned earlier, the incident of Peor, is mentioned by name here. It is still not that far back. It is in their memories enough to raise fear and a heart rate. If there is idolatry in play in this moment, history tells them that the whole congregation will end up tarred with the same brush. So they won't be having it. So they're turning up, one way or the other, to clean house. It goes on to say this, "Then Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh replied to the heads of the clans of Israel. The mighty one, God the Lord. The mighty one, God the Lord. He knows. And let Israel know, if this had been in rebellion or disobedience to the Lord, do not spare us this day. If we have built our own altar to turn away from the Lord and to offer burnt offerings and grain offerings or to sacrifice fellowship offerings on it, may the Lord himself call us to account. No, we did it for fear that someday your descendants might say to ours, what do you have to do with the Lord, the God of Israel? The Lord has made the Jordan a boundary between us and you, you Reubenites and Gadites. You have no share in the Lord. So your descendants might cause ours to stop fearing the Lord. That is why we said, let us get ready and build an altar, not for burnt offerings or sacrifices. On the contrary, it is to be a witness between us and you and the generations that follow, that we will worship the Lord at his sanctuary with our burnt offerings, sacrifices and fellowship offerings. Then in the future, your descendants will not be able to say to ours, you have no share in the Lord. Now, there are some interesting reasons. Some of the reasoning being used here is a little bit intriguing. We'll tap into that in a moment. But they do appear to have a good heart about things. There's comments here which we can learn a great deal from, both negatively and positively. The rest of the chapter tells us the priesthood is okay with their explanations, and the army leaves without a sword being drawn. Disaster is averted, rejoicing happens all around. Happily ever after. And the chapter ends with a naming ceremony. The Reubenites, the Gadites gave the altar this name, a witness between us, that the Lord is God. This morning, in our last few minutes, I want to use this chapter to focus on a different group of Christians. Remember, this whole chapter is done in the context, this whole series that we've done has been in the context of discipleship. Christians stepping into the discipleship they should be in. And we've signified that. We've used the image of crossing over Jordan, becoming a west of Jordan believer, to talk about stepping into discipleship that the Lord would want us to be in. Being in Canaan in this life is where we're supposed to be. But today, because the chapter calls us to, I'm going to turn some attention to east of Jordan Christians. I want to talk about the dangers of remaining there and a word of caution for the rest of the congregation. I have a few thoughts to leave with you here, and these are typified in my big old statement slides, and you can make notes of these as you go and explore these and consider these and debate them and study them and all those things, as you have been doing so with nobility over the weeks. My first point I want to say is this: east of Jordan Christians are those who have experienced God, but live more for the temporal than the eternal. This land that they formed was because they had livestock and they needed a place to put them. We got livestock, this land's looking pretty green, let's stay here. But the soldiers have actually seen another side of this journey of conquest and possession that the rest of these people haven't. They have seen God do great things while in the promised area. They've been in Canaan. They've been working with God's people. They've seen God come through in tremendous ways. They've got an experience of God that is truly amazing. And instead of calling all the people over east going, hey, let's just set up some paddocks there because it is our land technically, but get on over here with the people, they've gone, yeah, you know what? We're just going to go back and hang there now. We're done here. We're going to go hang back there. They've done so with Joshua's blessing. That's fine, but it's not all fine, as we'll soon see. This is a picture of people who want their spiritual cake and eat it too. And as one scholar said, they're more concerned with their cattle than their children. At the very beginning, in the days of Moses, they said, I'll go this far and no further. And I'll only cross over to the points that I kind of have to. I have enough to live well here. and I have enough to be just connected with the promise. As a result, east of Jordan Christians intentionally live in dangerous proximity to Egypt. And they will even point to God and blame the church and blame others for this occurring. Remember, east of Jordan, the land outside of Canaan was technically paying tribute to Egypt. Even in the Sinai Peninsula, it was Egyptian territory all up. It was part of the sovereign lands of Egypt. The Moabites and all these others had their spaces, but they were tributaries to Egypt in all this. The reproach of Egypt could not leave until you crossed Jordan, even though the major cities and the palace of Pharaoh was miles away. But these people are living right on the border of a promise, even outside of it just, and they're staying in a spot that is technically okay because Moses said, yeah, but they're still in dangerous proximity to Egypt. And here they said, down the line, it may well be that the conclusion will be that the Lord put the Jordan between us. No, the people put the Jordan between them. The people said, don't make us cross Jordan. We don't want to go there, we want to stay here. And here they're turning it around going, one day you're going to say, the Lord put that boundary there and we're not going to have a part of you. No, don't blame the congregation. Don't blame the people west for your unwillingness to cross over. If you're feeling vulnerable near Egypt, get over the Jordan and get away from it. Those on the east, as we see in this chapter, will try harder and harder to make their identity clear to the world because their proximity will suggest otherwise. All of a sudden, you become a works-driven Christian, not a grace-driven one. Works say try harder. Grace says just come on over and be part of the promise. They're trying harder by doing all these other stepping stones and all these other stuff to try to prove to the church they're part of them and trying to say to the world, hey, we're kind of close to you, but we're not with you. We're always trying to try harder, and it's a lot of hard work to do that. Identify with Christ unambiguously. Identify with him unambiguously in the way we live, in the way we worship, in the way we interact with the world. There is a clear distinction because we are a set-apart holy people. Be holy as I am holy. We should be different, not trying to hang out there and almost become a bit of a hybrid of what's on the border and what's over where we should be. East of Jordan Christians often lean on increasingly superficial and even artificial methods to demonstrate their connection to Christ. In this case, they're heaping up more stones, feeling like they need to convince the rest of the congregation that they belong. Remember, they put these stones up on the Canaan side, so that when they look across the river, they're going, hey, where you too? Can I remind you here, there is already a stone altar in that neighborhood. When Israel and the armed men of the eastern tribes crossed Jordan, they put an altar down to signify to the world that Israel had crossed over. They've already made an altar in this space. And now this second altar they've built has told the world that some have crossed back. Warren Wiersbe writes, what kind of witness was this huge pile of stones? Was it a witness to the unity of the nation and to the obedience of the Transjordanic tribes? No, it was a witness to expediency, the wisdom of man in trying to enjoy the best of both worlds. East of Jordan Christians live in the gap between two altars. And as a result, you will forever be in two minds. East of Jordan, you are definitely a Christian. That's why I'm using that phrase here, east of Jordan Christians. You've experienced God, you know the heavenly gift, but there's an altar that indicates I'm going back, and there's an altar that indicates I've crossed over. And we alternate between those two mindsets to the point that we will be asked, how long will we jump one side of the opinion or the other? How long will you remain in two minds? Which altar are you identifying with? East of Jordan Christians identify better when they serve with those in the West. If you are in the East, your safest bet is to be with the West as much as you can. In fact, in the scriptures here, they are not only permitted but commanded to do so. Your eastness, as it were, doesn't preclude you from service in the house of God. You are not a second-class Christian. For you to remain connected, you actually need to make that a priority even more and more. If you want to be on this outplace there, or if you're at a point where you can't progress in your Christian faith, or you don't want to grow more than you are, or there's different things holding you back and keeping you in this east space, you are encouraged time and again to get over west, to be with the fighting men of Israel, to be part of the glories and the things that God is doing. We notice that those in the east are given a share in the spoils of service. While you are there, you are getting the blessings. You are in that place and receiving all those things, and you are able to take those and be a blessing to the people that you represent. But instead of artificial connections, you are called to come and be part of the Western activity. Have a share not by stones but by action. To have a shared story by working together. If you want to stay east, find a way to serve. Because in that serving, you will find more and more of God's glory and actually be drawn further away from the east. You will find yourself increasingly safer. You will find yourself increasingly liking what you see because God is better than the world. To the Western Christians, we need to remember this, that East of Jordan Christians are part of the congregation. Sometimes a call to discipleship can leave some people a little despondent, and I respect that. I get that. Some of us are in the wilderness because you're a new believer. Some are learning how to rehearse and getting out of the things that look like Egypt, and you're kind of going through that process of learning what it is to come into this place that Jesus has for you. And there is a time frame. We call you a new convert for a reason. That's what it kind of represents. There's a period of time where the New Testament uses the word infancy to describe that. You will be, as you leave this sinful life, you will step into a time called infancy. It won't be a mature thing. You'll feel like, they look a long way off and they look a lot more advanced than me. Will I ever get there? Yes, you will. Put one foot in front of the other, keep doing the same thing, walk faithfully in the same direction, and Jesus will lead you there. But then when you have these times to progress in that, baptism is a great start. Well done to the 6 so far who are going to be baptized this afternoon. When those things occur, these are times where we step through something significant and go, you know what, I'm identifying less with what is behind me and I'm identifying more with what is set before me. The world behind me, the cross before me. But when we get to 40 years in faith and we haven't crossed over, yes, you're still part of the congregation, but you're making it really hard for yourself. But the reality is, church, they will remain a tribe until Christ returns. So, in that, we who are mature must always be on the lookout for those who are still learning and finding their way. That's the reason we have teachers in the church, to teach the ones still in the wilderness how to come to maturity, how to learn to speak truth in love, how to come to full measure of Christ, how to operate in the gifts he gives, how to step into that place that Jesus has for us. They will always be part of the congregation. In fact, it should be. If we don't have any East of Jordan Christians, then it probably means we haven't done anything evangelistic in a very long time. But as we go along, our job is to draw those people over, to call them westward, to let them participate with us in the Western space. They will be an ongoing presence in the life of the church, but they shouldn't remain there. West of Jordan Christians must remember those in the East and facilitate worship for them. But we must do so without diluting the way the East sometimes wants it done. Sometimes in our Eastern mindedness, we can kind of push back and go, can't you just dull it down a bit? Can't you just lower the standard a bit? Can't you just make it fit my worldview a little bit better? Can't you kind of retranslate Jesus a bit? No. Because we want to call you to the westward way. To build an altar like that, we're never going to sacrifice on it, but what if you do? What if that does become your shrine of worship? That was the fear of the people of Israel at this time. That altar that said, I'm going back, had to go. The call for every believer, friends, is for all of us to come on westward. Verse 19 of this chapter has this offer. And this comes from the rest of the congregation. And this is out of the New King James because I like this word better. If the land of your possession is unclean, then cross over to the land of the possession of the Lord, where the Lord's tabernacle stands, and take possession among us. There is always a call westward in our faith journey. In our discipleship, don't stay in proximity with Egypt to the point that you start looking east or towards their ways of things than we do the Lord's. Don't stay in these places of convenience for human temporal things. Look for eternal things. My question, my challenge this morning comes back to my introduction. Are you doing blockies with your faith? Does it feel like you're not getting out of second gear? Does it feel like things are revving but you're not going anywhere? Does it feel like you're stuck in a loop when it comes to matters of faith? It may well be that you're stuck on the wrong side of the Jordan and building altars that you use to justify staying there. Such elements of crossing over does begin with baptism, and that's an eminently pertinent thing for us today. The altar of crossing over will be their reference point going forward. If this has been a stumbling block, there's still room for you this morning. But it does continue with the ongoing walk of faith, the things we deem important to that. Which is more important, now or eternity? Your cattle or your kids, your present or your future, your legacy or what you have now? Your proximity to the house of God or your proximity to Egypt? The altar of crossing over or the altar of going back? Let's stop there and let us pray.